In my practice, I noticed a pattern that disturbed certain patients deeply. When empaths stopped absorbing their projections, these people would panic in ways I had not seen before. It was as if the empath had become dangerous simply by existing with boundaries. The reaction was not anger or frustration, it was genuine fear. And that fear revealed something about power dynamics that most people never recognize. Let me explain what I mean by boundaries in this context. I am not talking about walls or emotional distance. I am talking about the psychological capacity to distinguish between your own internal state and what others are trying to make you carry for them. When an empath develops this capacity, something shifts in every relationship they have. The people who are feeding off their lack of boundaries suddenly lose access to their primary resource. And their response to that loss is telling. I had a patient, Clara, 29 years old. She came to me exhausted from managing her mother's emotional instability. Her mother would call multiple times per day with crises that required immediate attention. Clara would drop everything to soothe her mother's anxiety, absorb her mother's rage, contain her mother's depression. After months of work, Clara learned to recognize when she was being used as an emotional repository. She began setting simple boundaries. She would not answer her phone during work hours. She would not process her mother's emotional states for her. She would listen, but would not absorb. The mother's reaction shocked Clara. Her mother told her she had become cold, cruel, unrecognizable. But what disturbed Clara most was the fear she heard in her mother's voice. Her mother was genuinely afraid of this version of Clara, who would not let herself be used. I asked Clara what had actually changed in how she treated her mother. She said nothing except that she stopped taking responsibility for emotions that were not hers. She still loved her mother. She still offered support. But she would not sacrifice her own psychological stability to maintain her mother's. That boundary, that simple act of self-preservation was experienced by her mother as a threat. And the fear in her mother's response revealed the true nature of their relationship. It had always been predicated on Clara's willingness to absorb what her mother could not process. This pattern repeated across dozens of cases in my practice. Empaths who developed boundaries were consistently met with fear from the people who had been exploiting them. Here is what I learned about why this happens. People who rely on empaths to process their psychological waste are operating from a position of deep unconsciousness. They have never developed the capacity to contain their own shadow material. They project it outward and find receptive hosts who will carry it for them. When the empath stops being receptive, these people face something terrifying. They are forced to confront the psychological contents they have been avoiding their entire lives. The empath's boundary throws their own shadow back at them, and they are not equipped to handle it. This creates genuine panic, not because the empath has done anything cruel, but because the empath is no longer serving as their psychological waste disposal system. I documented this response pattern extensively. The people who reacted with the most intense fear were always the ones most dependent on the empath's lack of boundaries. They had built their entire psychological equilibrium on the assumption that the empath would always be available to absorb their unprocessed material. When that assumption proved false, their equilibrium collapsed. Stay with me, because what I discovered about how these people attempt to restore the old dynamic explains much about psychological manipulation. The first response is always to pathologize the empath's boundaries. The empath is told they have become selfish, cold, changed in some fundamental way. This is projection. The person is experiencing their own psychological discomfort and attributing it to the empath's cruelty rather than their own dependence. I watched this happen with Clara's mother. She began telling family members that Clara had become unstable, that therapy had damaged her, that she was no longer the loving daughter she had raised. All of this was an unconscious attempt to pressure Clara back into the role of emotional container. But what these people do not understand is that boundaries, once established through conscious psychological work, are very difficult to break. The empath has seen too clearly how they were being used. They cannot unsee it. Clara told me her mother's accusations no longer affected her the way they once would have. She could recognize them as manipulation attempts rather than truth. This recognition is what made her terrifying to her mother. She could no longer be controlled through guilt or shame. The second response I documented was isolation attempts. The person would withdraw affection, give silent treatment, or rally others against the empath. The goal is always the same, to make the cost of boundaries so high that the empath surrenders them to restore connection. This tactic works on empaths who have not done deep psychological work on their fear of abandonment. But for empaths who have integrated that fear consciously, the isolation attempts fail. They would rather be alone than return to being exploited. I had another patient, Martin, 34. He set boundaries with a colleague who had been using him to process work frustrations for years. The colleague responded by excluding Martin from social events, spreading rumors about his competence, and attempting to damage his professional reputation. Martin told me the experience was painful but clarifying. He realized the relationship had never been genuine friendship. It had been a one-sided extraction system where he provided emotional labor and received nothing in return except the illusion of connection. Once he saw that clearly, the colleague's isolation tactics lost their power. Martin was no longer willing to trade his psychological health for fake belonging. The third response is what I call the extinction burst. When the first two tactics fail, the person escalates dramatically. They create a crisis that seems to require the empath's intervention. They threaten self-harm. They manufacture emergencies. They pull out every manipulation tool to force the empath back into the old role. This is the most dangerous phase because it tests whether the empath's boundaries are truly integrated or just intellectually understood. Many empaths collapse during extinction bursts and return to the old patterns out of fear or guilt. But the empaths who survive this phase emerge psychologically invincible. They have proven to themselves that they can maintain boundaries even under extreme pressure. And this is when they become truly terrifying to the people who are exploiting them. They cannot be guilted. They cannot be shamed. They cannot be manipulated back into self-sacrifice. They have developed what I call conscious immunity to psychological exploitation. In a moment, I will show you exactly what creates this immunity and why it is so threatening to certain personality types. The immunity develops through a specific psychological process. The empath must first recognize the pattern of exploitation clearly, not just intellectually, but viscerally. They must feel in their body how they have been used and what it has cost them. This recognition creates what I call righteous anger. Not rage or vindictiveness, but a clean anger at the violation of their psychological boundaries. This anger is necessary. It provides the energy needed to maintain boundaries when pressure is applied. Clara told me that when her mother would attempt to guilt her during phone calls, she would feel this anger rise in her chest. Not anger at her mother as a person, but anger at the manipulation attempt. That anger reminded her why boundaries were necessary. It protected her from sliding back into old patterns out of misplaced compassion. The second component of immunity is what I call conscious selfishness. The empath must learn to prioritize their own psychological health without shame or apology. This is not narcissism. It is appropriate self-regard. But to people who benefited from the empath's self-neglect, it looks like cruelty. Martin described this shift perfectly. He said he stopped asking himself whether his boundaries were selfish and started asking whether they were necessary for his well-being. That reframe changed everything. His boundaries were no longer up for negotiation based on others' discomfort. The third component is acceptance of relationship loss. The empath must be willing to lose connections that cannot survive their boundaries. This is perhaps the hardest component because empaths typically value connection above almost everything else. But I learned that empaths who successfully integrate boundaries develop a different definition of connection. They realize that relationships based on their self-sacrifice were never true connections. They were exploitation systems disguised as love or friendship or family obligation. True connection can only happen between two people who both take responsibility for their own psychological material. When one person consistently dumps their unprocessed shadow onto the other, that is not connection. That is psychological parasitism. Once empaths understand this distinction, they become willing to lose parasitic relationships to make space for genuine ones. And that willingness makes them untouchable to manipulators. I want to be clear about something. Not everyone who reacts badly to an empath's boundaries is a conscious manipulator. Many are simply unconscious people who have never developed their own emotional processing capabilities. They genuinely do not understand that what they are asking from the empath is unreasonable. But conscious or unconscious, the effect is the same. They are using the empath's psychological resources without consent or reciprocity. And when the empath withdraws those resources, they panic. The fear these people experience is the fear of being forced to grow up psychologically. The empath's boundaries require them to develop capacities they have avoided developing their entire lives. Emotional self-regulation, shadow integration, psychological self-sufficiency. These are difficult developmental tasks. And many people would rather attack the empath than face them. This is why bounded empaths become threatening. They force psychological development in everyone around them simply by refusing to carry others' unprocessed material. And to people committed to unconsciousness, that forcing function feels like violence. But it is not violence. It is the natural consequence of one person choosing psychological health over enabling another's stagnation. I documented numerous cases where empaths' boundaries catalyzed growth in people around them. Not immediately, and often only after significant resistance. But eventually, when the option of dumping their psychological waste onto the empath was removed, some people learned to process it themselves. Clara's mother eventually sought her own therapy, not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. Clara would no longer serve as her emotional container. The mother had to develop that capacity herself or live in constant psychological discomfort. 2 years later, Clara told me her relationship with her mother had improved dramatically. Not because Clara had softened her boundaries, but because her mother had finally learned to manage her own emotional states. The relationship became mutual for the first time in Clara's life. This is the paradox. The empath's boundaries that initially seem to damage relationships often save them by forcing them to become actual relationships instead of exploitation systems. But this transformation only happens if the empath maintains boundaries through the fear, guilt, and manipulation attempts, and that requires extraordinary psychological strength. Where does that strength come from? In my experience, it comes from finally valuing yourself as much as you value others. That shift in priority is what makes boundaries possible. Most empaths have been taught their entire lives that self-sacrifice is virtue, that considering their own needs is selfishness, that love means absorbing others' pain without complaint. These teachings create psychological servitude. Breaking free requires rejecting those teachings at a fundamental level. It requires recognizing that you deserve the same care and consideration you give others, that your psychological health matters as much as anyone else's. This recognition is revolutionary for empaths, and it is terrifying for people who benefited from their servitude. I spent years helping empaths develop this self-valuation. The process is difficult because it requires going against decades of conditioning. But the empaths who succeed become psychologically free in ways that transform their entire lives. They stop being available for one-sided relationships. They stop absorbing other shadow material. They stop sacrificing themselves to maintain connections that were never genuine. And they discover something remarkable. When they stop being psychological doormats, they attract different kinds of people. People capable of reciprocity. People who value them for who they are rather than what they provide. People who want actual connection instead of extraction systems. This shift in social environment reinforces the boundaries. The empath is no longer isolated in a world of takers. They have found givers, people who understand that relationships require mutual psychological responsibility. But getting to that point requires surviving the fear-based reactions of people who lose access to their services. And that survival requires something I rarely saw in my practice, the willingness to be alone rather than exploited. Empaths who cannot tolerate solitude will always collapse their boundaries when isolation pressure is applied. But empaths who have developed a relationship with themselves can withstand any amount of social pressure. They know who they are when nobody else is in the room. They have an internal sense of worth that does not depend on being needed or useful to others. This internal foundation makes them unshakable. And it is this unshakability that narcissists and other exploitative personality types find most terrifying. They cannot find the lever to manipulate someone who has internalized their own value. Before we close, I want you to consider something. If you set boundaries with the people in your life who drain you most, how would they react? Would they respect your limits, or would they panic, guilt you, or attempt to punish you for prioritizing your well-being? Their reaction tells you everything you need to know about whether they value you as a person or as a resource. The empaths who transform from psychological containers into bounded individuals do not become less caring. They become more discerning about where they direct their care. They love consciously instead of compulsively. They support strategically instead of automatically. This conscious boundaried empathy is what makes them powerful. And power in someone you were exploiting is always experienced as threat. The work is learning to tolerate being seen as threatening by people who benefited from your exploitation. Learning to recognize their fear as validation that your boundaries are working rather than evidence that you are being cruel. You are not cruel for refusing to sacrifice yourself. You are sane, and your sanity is what makes you terrifying to people invested in your servitude.